All right, class, this is the remainder of your Chapter 4 lecture for this week. And so we'll just run through the rest of what's going on with society at the time of colonization. And where we left off in periods 2 and 4 was taking a look at the Chesapeake colony. If you're in period 1, you got a little bit further than this, so you may want to fast forward by just a bit. But this is where we left off, taking a look at how in the Chesapeake, you had colonists that were living in areas with tobacco production. Tobacco was really rough on the soil, sucked out all the nutrients. And oftentimes what would happen is as people moved inland, they'd grow plantation tobacco. The tobacco crop would then use up the nutrients in the soil, and then you just have colonists that would move further and further inland, again, crushing up against Native Americans and causing conflict. You also had overproduction that was going on. So with more tobacco being raised, you also then had people getting worse and worse prices for their tobacco, and as a result, then they had to grow more in order to be able to keep doing okay. Miss Hall has just arrived, and so she is not certain what is. We're doing a screencast-o-matic to flip classes for them.
Sorry, I know. I just wanted to interrupt you.
You're all good. So when it comes to tobacco production, what's happening for the colonists is they are going to be setting up plantations because tobacco is in demand back in Europe. But the problem is you had white people who would come over and they'd be living in a malarial zone. And so you'd have half the people die. Diseases were horrible. You had Native Americans who were dying because of the diseases. And when it came to African slaves, they were being used in the West Indies, but not so much in America. But because of the fact that many of the people who were being captured in slavery had experience with malaria, yellow fever, and had some resistance to those diseases, African slaves are going to become quite popular inside Virginia. But at first, Virginia and Maryland are going to use what's called the headright system, where they're going to be giving away 50 acres of land to any plantation owner who brings workers into the New World. These indentured servants will be serving for 3, 5, sometimes 7 years. And when you're an indentured servant, you have no rights, you have no protections. You're coming from the poorest of the poor back in Europe. Oftentimes it's men being brought over to work on the farms. And the biggest problem is the fact that for many of these individuals, they don't know that they're walking into a malaria zone. And so the half of them are going to die when they get there. Many of them are also going to be overworked. And so indentured servitude is going to allow plantations to get big. It's going to allow workers to come to the New World. When indentured servants get done with their jobs, though, they're going to be shoved out into the western areas by the Appalachian Mountains, into Native American territory. Some will move to North Carolina as squatters. But eventually there's going to be a gigantic rebellion in 1676 called Bacon's Rebellion. And it's going to be against Governor Berkeley, who is protecting the large plantation owners, since they're the ones in the House of Burgesses protecting his job. But he's not really looking out for former indentured servants. Bacon's Rebellion is largely about frustration that these indentured servants who are now free have about Native Americans, and they want to kill and remove the Native Americans from the western frontier in Virginia. Bacon also would like to become part of the upper elite inside Virginia, and so he leads a revolution. He leads all these indentured servants, slaves, to attack Jamestown, and then he dies midway through that rebellion. And afterwards, Governor Berkeley, with the planters, is going to horribly suppress the indentured servants, and they're going to be very much looking at that as a bad working source. They're going to look instead for other type of labor, and in 1619, slaves had been brought to Virginia. Slavery had been introduced at that time, and that's going to end up taking off quite a bit. So at this point, you've got a turning point. 1676 is your turning point. Indentured servitude drops. Use of African slaves is going to increase. And eventually this is going to become very much a booming business, not just in the South, but also in the North. We're going to find that with African slaves also, they're being transported to North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean. And they're going to be part of what's known as the Middle Passage in the Triangular Trade. That's going to be bringing slaves from Africa to the West Indies and some to the Americas itself. We're going to also find that with Virginia, they're going to be looking for how they can make sure that African slaves do not become like Bacon's Rebellion. And so they're going to set up slave codes that are based very much on the Barbados slave codes that are in existence in the Carolinas. And this is the idea that you're not going to allow slaves to read or write or move freely or have their freedom during their lifetime just so they can be maintained as a safe workforce. What you will find, though, is there's an odd dynamic going on that they're choosing to make African slaves Christians. And with the Christian religion, we don't have any today. With the Christian religion, it's an odd religion to teach African slaves because of the fact that there are so many stories of resistance, where you have stories of Jesus standing up to powerful people, or you have the stories of Moses going into Egypt and freeing the slaves. And so we're going to have the Christian faith be put onto slaves in America to try to Americanize them. But there's not an idea that it's going to make Africans equal. But we will find that this is going to then shape the character of what African-American slave experience is going to be. We will also find then that owning slaves becomes then the status symbol for being to move up in society. And so we'll find that in order to be somebody in the House of Burgesses, you need to have a large plantation through the headright system, which means indentured servitude, and then slavery. And what we'll find is during those first few decades of Jamestown, that's when our planter class is kind of moving up and down, and then eventually it just locks in because they create rules to protect themselves against other people moving up into that upper crust. We are going to find that for the planters, they are working as business people trying to manage large plantations, but what we also need to recognize is that the planter elite who owns plantations are largely settled along the waterways going into the interior of Virginia. But by and far, most white people in the South during this time period do not own a lot of slaves. Most of them own no slaves. So what we'll find is there's a class system where we get this ideal of just all white people owning slaves on large plantations. Instead, you've got different categories of people at different status points. We will find also that for those large plantation owners, they're going to look down on both African Americans and white people who are either current or former indentured servants, seeing them as essentially white trash. And so we'll find that there's different grades of class inside of the southern colonies, and it's very hard to move up and down. They have very few cities in the Deep South. They're going to have very few professionals doing anything outside of agriculture. Any towns they have are used for trade in the fall, and that's about it. And virtually everybody who is down there is farming, either on a large plantation that's isolated or a small farm that's isolated. The best way to move stuff is with water routes. Roads are horrible, and so if you're not along the water, typically you're not going to be moving up very quickly in class. In New England, though, you've got people who are establishing John Winthrop's city on a hill, and as a result of where they settle, they actually get some evidence to prove that they're on the right track. They start believing that they are God's chosen people because they start living longer than anybody else in Europe. These are the first people to consistently have faith that they are going to be grandparents someday. And part of the reason why is because they didn't settle in a swamp. They're living in an area with climate kind of like Minnesota's, where insects don't get big enough or live long enough to cultivate horrible malarial sorts of diseases. They come over as whole families or whole communities so they can nurture one another. They're living in towns so they can support one another when they're doing their jobs, looking out for young and old. And so we're going to find that there's a creation of a society that's quite stable, unlike the Chesapeake that has a lot of turmoil. We will find that in the New England colony, Puritans see marriage as being God's gift. Having children is seen as having God's gift. And so we will find that in New England, they are very much valuing the size of families that they can produce, and this is going to be great for them in the first couple generations. We're going to find also that when we take a look at what's going on during this time period, we want to understand that for women in both the North and the South, we will find that women are still treated as in a patriarchal society, that men are typically in control of most of the decision making. We will find that there are some instances where women are able to maintain rights, especially in the South, where it was common that a man might pass away and a woman would need to take care of the plantation until kids grew up. In New England, where things are more stable, though, you see a much more patriarchal or man-focused society that was taking place. We are going to find also that for women in New England, they're not going to be allowed to vote. Many of their rights are not going to be in place that we have nowadays as a result of feminism. And we are going to be finding, like we described in class, that when it came to childbirth, we're going to find that midwives are on the scene to be able to help make childbirth much safer. As we described in class, midwifery means that you've got a woman who has either had a lot of children or else she knows what goes on during the pregnancy process, and as a result, she is going to be then able to help women to give birth themselves. This, especially in New England and urban areas, is going to help make the process a lot easier. So when we take a look at what's going on with New England and the family structure they have, you should notice what's going on when it comes to marriage. People were allowed to marry based out of love in New England, and oftentimes you would have people choosing spouses that were pretty close to where they were in the class system, either upper, middle, lower, or whatever. You didn't have very many divorces, and in fact, that was seen as a failure by the community. So they'd often be encouraging families to try to work out situations that might be resulting in a divorce. But if you did have somebody who ran away, or else if they had an affair with somebody else, that could be a way for a divorce to be ended in Puritan New England. But remember, these guys are ones who believe religiously that they're on the right track to be able to go to heaven, and that would be something that would be very much a sin that would be hard to overcome. So for many people in New England, they're going to be trying to figure out ways to live what is prescribed as a really godly life. They're going to be settling in towns, and then outside the town is going to be small farms that are surrounding the town itself, and Puritanism is going to be key for that group. They're going to try to figure out ways so that they can take care of one another and help each other out. And so their community is going to be based around a town structure. They're going to have a village green where they're going to be able to drill their militia, get together with people if they want to meet. The church and school will be right on that same tract. And they're going to make sure that everybody who is in that area is going to have the basics that they need to survive. So they're not of the mindset that it's rugged individualism and you just figure stuff out. Instead, they're going to make sure that people have a spot where they can get wood, that they can grow crops, that they can feed their animals, because that's what's needed for them to be able to survive and do well. They also very much are excited about providing public education, with the idea that if you want to have a religious society to be a city on a hill, people have to be able to read the Bible. And so that's the reason why they make that their emphasis. They're also going to create colleges like Harvard in 1636. Yale will be coming soon afterwards. And so they believe in higher education. They believe in churches that do not have a pope. Instead, they're congregational, which means each congregation makes their own decisions. And they're going to have their own democracies. They're voting for themselves. They're choosing who are the leaders in the town. They're going to be making decisions about where roads should go and whatever. They're operating as their own city governments and totally independent. We're going to find, though, that with the Puritans, they've got a problem. So what I want you to keep in mind is you have the Great Puritan Migration of 1630. Just because a community starts off in a certain way doesn't mean that that's the way it's going to be forever and ever. When I think of Armstrong High School, I graduated in 1990. Your school is different than the school that I went to, and that's totally fine. And it's weird to then say that the way things were when I was in school should be the way things are always going to be, because new generations have new ways of thinking. What we will find, though, is during this time period, you're going to have preachers who are traveling around, and they're delivering Jeremiads where they're seeing people who are becoming less enthusiastic about Puritanism. And that would make sense because they're no longer in England. They're not trying to purify the Anglican Church. So that enthusiasm is starting to drop off because they can have their own church here without having to worry about purifying anything. So Jeremiah is a fire and brimstone speech that's meant to scare you into behaving because you're worried you're going to go to hell. By 1662, though, there's a problem emerging. Many of the leaders in the church who became Puritans did so with a conversion experience. To become a full member, you need to start off as something else and then convert into Puritanism once you discover what God wants from you. They've been using that as a way to freeze out younger generations, but now you've got the older Puritans dying, and they're realizing they're going to have nobody to hand the church off to who are full members. So they create the halfway covenant that says that if you are somebody who's participating in church and you're related to a Puritan, you can become a partial member of the church, and the church can then carry on. Rather than in making people enthusiastic, though, this is going to be something that just allows the Puritan church to keep going forward for the period of time until eventually we're going to have a great awakening where the church gets torn apart. We're also going to find, though, that there are many people who are worrying about the Puritan church. So if you notice nowadays in the United States, there are people who are worried about America slipping. There's a slogan of "Make America Great Again," as if we are now slipping as a country into something that's worse. And so that's what's going to be scaring a lot of people who are Puritans. There's this feeling that they've now peaked and that they're now going downhill, especially with the Dominion of New England and the loss of their original charter. Women are going to be worried inside their families because they're the ones who believe they're trying to protect their family's souls. So in 1692, you get a chance to see mass hysteria inside your textbook, where there's an accusation that witches are terrorizing people in the communities. And as a result, you're going to have people killed because of these accusations.